All right, good morning, everyone. I'm not used to saying good morning, but seems that at Network 2020, we've turned our clocks back a little bit earlier than the United States because both this and our next briefing are starting at 11 a.m. So thank you all for joining us a little bit earlier than usual. My name is Courtney Doggart. I'm the president of Network 2020. We are an inclusive international community, and we're really focused on bridging the gap between the private sector and the international affairs community. We work through educational programs like these briefings that we have. We have foreign affairs discussion groups, and then we also run some research and impact programs as well, such as we have a Bold Fellows program where we are training young entrepreneurs from Bosnia and now Serbia. That's an outgrowth of some of our research. So we do a whole lot of things. Please do check out our website and social media for more details. And just so you all know, our briefings are available after on our YouTube channel. So if you have a friend or a colleague who couldn't catch it, please do feel free to direct them to our YouTube channel. So it is an honor to be here again today with Professor Sheri Berman and to welcome Susi Dennison to dig into some of the political trends in Europe, the mainstreaming of far-right parties, and we will dig into what's behind these trends and put them in historical context and really better understand the overall situation. So Professor Sheri Berman, welcome back. She is a professor of political science at Barnard College, Columbia University. And her research focuses on European history and politics, the development of democracy, populism and fascism, and the history of the left. So just the right person we need to put all of this in context. And we're very pleased to welcome Susi Dennison. She is a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and her topics of focus include strategy, politics, and governance of European foreign policy, migration, and the toolkit for Europe as a global actor. So welcome to both of you. It's a pleasure to have you here today. So just to begin, I'm going to start with you, Sheri, starting where I usually like to start, which is making sure that we are all on the same page. So what do we mean by far-right parties, and what differentiates them from traditional right-wing or conservative parties? And more importantly, how can we understand recent events within the context of European history?
So thanks, I'm really happy to be here. And that's actually a more complicated question than might appear on the surface. So especially after the recent elections in Italy and Sweden, where we saw significant electoral advances for the Brothers of Italy and the Sweden Democrats, there's been a lot of discussion of this issue because both of these parties have roots in neo-Nazi or neo-fascist movements, but have, at least on the surface, moderated really quite significantly over the past years. And so whether it is still correct to call them far right is debated. They prefer not to see themselves as far right parties. They call themselves social conservatives, national conservatives, because they understand that there's not a lot of support for neo-fascist or neo-Nazi parties in Western Europe. So let me say that I think this is a question that requires some more discussion. However, in an abstract way, right, when social scientists talk about far-right parties, they are talking about parties with questionable commitments to democracy and with questionable commitments to things that we think unavoidably go with democracy in the West, like liberalism and pluralism. So when I would use the term far-right, I would use that term to apply to a party whose interests in democracy, commitment to democracy, I question, whose commitments to plural societies, I question, whose commitments to protecting, championing even liberal rights, free press, freedom of association, protection for minorities, I am unsure of. So that's the difference between a far right and a conservative party. A conservative party may have, all kinds of policy preferences that I or others might disagree with, but there is no doubt that these are parties that are committed to playing within the liberal democratic rules of the game. A far-right party is not. So the interesting question is whether what we see in Western Europe are indeed far-right parties and therefore a threat to democracy, or just a variant, perhaps one that many of us do not like, of conservatism.
Thank you. That was a very helpful way to pull that apart. So Susie, turning to you, and maybe we can dig into where Sheri left off a little bit. Why are we seeing an increase in the elections of far-right governments in Europe, particularly in Sweden and Italy? And what do these parties offer that resonate with the electorate?
So yeah, thank you very much for having me as well. I'm really excited to be here and having this conversation. I think for me, there are three big things that are concerning European citizens at the moment and is sort of driving the way we're seeing them vote. The first of these is hard security. We're in a situation that very few Europeans were expecting even a year ago in Europe, that we're facing war within what we understand as our geographical space now with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And if you look at public opinion polls in terms of the way that Europeans think about this war, that the number one concern is about escalation of the conflict to a point that would involve NATO, probably through the engagement of nuclear weapons. And that varies a lot depending on which part of Europe you're in. I was recently in Poland, and I was quite struck by the fact that if you go the further east you go within Europe, the more citizens are concerned about what they perceive as a realistic prospect of the land war spreading to where they are. So this feels very close. People are scared from the sort of hard security point of view. The second big thing that they're worried about is rising cost of living. I'm talking to you from France. Here we've had mass mobilizations about the cost of living. We've seen 2 kilometer miles at the petrol pumps. And we're being told that Germany and other key economies are expecting to go into recession next year. So people are very worried about how they're going to sort of meet make ends meet at the end of the month. And they feel that their national governments aren't delivering on this at the moment. And then the third big thing that I think is a factor in this sort of drift rightwards that we've seen in recent elections in Europe is migration. We saw an overwhelming openness to Ukrainian refugees at the beginning of Russia's invasion, very, very different to the lack of openness to Syrian refugees in 2015, 2016 across many European states. And a lot of that has been led by citizens, NGOs, and so on, just a willingness to welcome these people into their homes, into their communities and so on. But we're now facing the prospect in Europe of what you might call a long war scenario. We've seen Putin increase the mobilization efforts on the Russian side. And I think that people are sort of adjusting to the real possibility that this could just sort of turn into a war of attrition and end up in a sort of frozen conflict situation, which may well mean increased numbers of refugees coming to Europe. And I think that there are a lot of countries, again, this is affecting particularly the east of Europe, but you take countries like Sweden, they feel the proximity on this question too, who feel that they're sort of at capacity in terms of how much they can support, because the burden really hasn't been shared evenly across the European space on migration. So I think it's these kind of three big things that are driving in voters' minds a sense that they need a government that will speak to these big challenges, that will take them seriously, and the sort of the nationalist story that the kind of the turning inwards to the national level against a frightening international environment is something which seems to be persuading citizens in light of those concerns at the moment.
Thank you. I want to stay on your two answers just for a minute, because on the one hand, we have Sheri, who is saying that, well, it really depends on whether or not these parties are turning away from this idea of traditional Western liberal values. And Susie, you just spoke about, the electorate's very real and valid concerns. Do you see that? But no mention of, it's a turning away from values that is drawing them in. Do you see those very real concerns overshadowing any potential turn away from liberal values, or is that just not an issue yet?
Is that directed towards
Oh,
Susi?
for Susi, yeah,
Okay,
I just wanted to
sorry.
see what, is that at all a concern in the minds of people?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I'm interested in Sheri's reaction on this too. For me, I would say that the sort of the increase in numbers of people who are willing to vote for parties which have, you know, have come through sort of fascist routes in the case of Italy, and for parties which, you know, in Sweden there used to be a kind of cordon sanitaire, a refusal by democratic parties to work with the Sweden Democrats. But I think the increased willingness among voters who used to be mainstream comes more from a place about these kind of security, economic concerns, about the way that the kind of, it's more a sort of a rejection of the way that they feel their country is currently being handled, than necessarily a turn towards the values of that are being put forward. I suppose I would see it more as a kind of a compromise vote. I'll settle for a party that may pose risks in terms of its kind of moral agenda, because I'm feeling really scared about my immediate future. But obviously these parties do also have a core base who do share those agendas, and you know, I think that's where the concerning point is for the next few years. It's about how those things are balanced. And
Sheri, I'd love to hear your response on that too, as well as, you know, are these concerns hypothetical or are they real? And how do you pull apart, you know, if they're saying, well, you know, we're not those roots, we're really just about law and order and about, you know, these other issues. How are you determining whether or not they've abandoned the values?
So let me first link back to something Susi said, and then loop forward to that latter question. I think that it's very important when we look at these parties, and in fact any party that's operating in a multi-party system where they're not the only actors, right? And understand that their success or failure depends not just on what they do, but on what other parties do. And I think that is perhaps even more true of populist, what we call, you know, whatever right-wing populist parties, that is to say parties that sort of emerge as protests against the existing party system, order, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, it's very important that we understand that, you know, Meloni and the Brothers of Italy were the only party really standing outside of what was a somewhat consensus around the previous government. So if you were dissatisfied, as Italian voters have clearly been with good reason for the past 20 or 30 years with the way things are going over this past electoral cycle, the only party that was not directly implicated was the Brothers of Italy, right? And so, you know, anyone who wanted to protest against the status quo, this party was an attractive option simply because it was not physically part of that consensus. Now, with the Sweden Democrats, the situation is a little different, but also similar. Up through the, you know, giant refugee crisis of 2015 through 16, there was not a single party, including the traditional parties of the right in Sweden, that was offering what would have been up to then a traditional conservative position on migration issues. They were all pretty much on board with an extremely generous, extremely progressive, extremely open approach to refugees and migration. Now, again, I'm guessing probably most of the people on this call are as well, but the point is that if you were a person who was not necessarily racist or xenophobic, but thought to yourself, wow, you know, 20 or 30 years ago, this was a country that was as homogenous as can be. And over the course of a generation, and particularly over the course of 2015 or 16, the demographics of my country have changed really dramatically. And along with it, a lot of other social trends and issues. You simply had no place to turn but the Sweden Democrats. There was not a quote unquote traditional conservative option out there. So I think, again, part of what we need to do is recognize how these parties fit into the larger systems that they are embedded in, and think about, you know, what actually they are representing to voters. So I just to sort of let go inside. Now, the question of, do we take them at their word? Are these no longer neo-fascist or neo-Nazi parties? Are they committed to playing by the democratic rules of the game, albeit offering within that socially conservative or nationally conservative policies? Well, I would say wait and see. Thus far, they have certainly, at least on the surface, distanced themselves from those pasts, expelling people who are caught with membership in these organizations, expelling people who say very obviously racist or xenophobic things dramatically, particularly in the case of the Sweden Democrats, because that party's older now, moderating their positions on things like immigration and national identity. But, wait and see. These parties now are growing. They are both now, Brothers of Italy is actually, the key party in that coalition, and the Sweden Democrats, although outside of government, are the largest party of the right and therefore significantly influencing the direction of government. If these parties start to do things that are not just conservative, but are potentially undermining of democracy, then I would reassess my evaluations of them. But I think there is something dangerous about us not recognizing potential moderation simply because you want to reward that, right? It's one thing to say, I don't like these parties' positions. They are very socially conservative, national conservative either, but they are no longer neo-Nazi or fascist. You want to keep moderating these parties, right? And so if you continue to say that they are neo-Nazi and neo-fascist when they are not, and again, trust but verify, I think we are doing a disservice to what democracy is supposed to do, which is try to push extremists away from extreme positions and back into the democratic family.
Thank you. Sure. Oh, yes, Susie, yeah, go, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a two-finger point on that. I feel quite sort of nervous with the wait and see approach, but I feel quite uncomfortable with it in principle. But I am inclined to agree, and I just wanted to draw attention to the fact that the government, the coalition arrangement that has been agreed in Sweden is quite interesting in that it sort of invests in the democratic structure. So the Sweden Democrats have taken a decision, or it has been agreed in the negotiation process, that they're not holding ministerial posts, but rather they've got control of some of the most influential parliamentary committees, sort of effectively to hold the government to account on the agreed agenda between them. And I think that, in light of what Sheri is saying, that is quite an interesting decision. I think it's fascinating psychologically in terms of sort of whether they perceive themselves as a kind of a real party of government, or whether in fact they do sort of perceive themselves as needing to put in place checks on a system that has kind of got slightly out of control from their point of view. But it does imply that they intend to work with the the democratic system rather than against it.
Thank you. Excellent point. That's great. Sheri, going back to you, we've been talking a lot about Sweden and Italy, but obviously there have been some precedents that have been set, particularly in Poland and Hungary. So, have you seen any, have countries shared common sources of funding or election strategy? And what role does Viktor Orban in Hungary or Jarosław Kaczynski of Poland play, if any, in what you've been seeing happening?
Right. So, particularly Orban and his party, these are not really, should not be called populist parties, at least not if you're including within that rubric also, parties like the National Rally in France or the Sweden Democrats in Sweden. Why? Because that is clearly not a democratic party in the small d sense of the term. Hungary is not a democracy anymore. It is an electoral autocracy. There is not this, they're not even the basic foundation of democracy, free and fair elections, that just does not exist in Hungary anymore. So I think it is important that even though, we might see these parties as on a continuum, and to get back to your question, certainly in a rhetorical sense, they are, in the sense that, they're constantly praising each other, patting each other on the back. Orban likes it when the Brothers of Italy won. It's a little bit more complicated in Sweden. These parties, see themselves on some level, perhaps as part of a sort of a movement with some international similarities. So there is that, and I think that is something definitely notice and be wary of. As far as funding is concerned, I mean, this is a very complicated issue. There's been a lot of discussion about, for instance, Russian funding of a lot of these party scandals in places like Austria. Marine Le Pen notoriously has funds that were borrowed from a Russian bank that she's eager, of course, now to pay back. This is less the case in Sweden. The other thing I would say on this note is that these parties, and the two that we've mentioned of recent significance, both the Brothers of Italy and the Sweden Democrats, very successful with social media. And I bring that up here because they tend to be really quite good in attracting, sort of large numbers of supporters in countries where it's allowed. Oftentimes, sort of small donations. This is true of the Republican Party in the United States as well. So, it varies a bit depending on the system. The kinds of campaign and funding that's allowed in different countries is different. Yeah, I mean, talk of Russian funding is real, but it varies, and it's a little hard to know how much is going on. Like I said, there are definitely signs of that in places and scandals in places like France and Austria, where these kinds of things have been uncovered. But how much fund? I do not think the Sweden Democrats are probably dependent on Russian funding. But yeah.
Thanks. And you brought up social media, and I wanted to turn to you, Susie, and just see if you had any insight that you wanted to offer on the role that social media may be playing in the popularity of these groups.
Well, I think that social media is a sort of a key feature of all elections in Europe now, and sort of very much part of the reality and the kind of the system that voters use to make their decisions about how they're going to vote and so on and so forth. And I think that it is also one of the ways in which there is kind of join up across between different parties with a kind of similar nationalist agenda across different European settings, because it's much easier now to kind of to forward sort of an idea, and that can sort of have a big impact on an election scenario, or photos of some of these key leaders together at key moments. I think that sort of all plays a role in, if you like, and I think this is probably more true if you look at the Italian election context that we've been discussing maybe than the Sweden one. That I think that has kind of played a sort of a key role in legitimizing a figure such as Giorgia Meloni, who doesn't sort of have such a track record as a statesperson, as a sort of a pair of hands that can deal with the international picture. So I think that it's key in that sense. But unfortunately, it is also sort of key in terms of the ability to manipulate the electoral debate from outside. That, I have to say, but I'm not an expert on this, is not something that I've seen sort of particularly assessed in the cases that we're discussing here today. It's been a big feature, Russian disinformation in recent French election campaigns. But I think that there was a kind of a certain momentum that, as I said, I think comes back more to sort of the national context in these elections that has led to the outcomes that we've ended up with. But it's nevertheless there. But yeah, I do think that one of the interesting trends is the way in which the sort of the online element of elections gives this sort of semblance of a sort of an international coalition between nationalist parties that in reality is much thinner than it appears.
Great, thank you for that. For better or for worse, social media is something I guess we're going to have to contend with from here on out. Susie, staying with you, we've been talking a lot about these elections sort of in domestically within their own context, but obviously they are taking place within the larger context of the European Union. So how do you see the views of these right-wing or further right-wing governments impacting the European Union? What impact will they have? Are there areas where they agree? What might happen in the places where they disagree?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is definitely a point to watch. What we've seen so far in the case of Giorgia Meloni's government, because she's had a few more weeks than the Swedish government for this to start to play out, is that the realities of geopolitics are going to make it very difficult for her to sort of deliver on some of the sharper parts of her early election campaign, at least. So, even ahead of the elections, she's kind of started shifting her position with regards to pulling away from the European consensus against Russia. And one of her first actions once in government was to call Zelensky and reassure him of Italy's support and so on. She's also, I think, been sort of given quite sharp warnings from Brussels and other European capitals about her plans to renegotiate Italy's budget deal and so on and so forth. And so I think that the sort of the risk at this point of Italy kind of shifting out of the European kind of agreed consensus around the sanctions packages against Russia is quite minimal. And so there, I think you do have sort of big differences between the Melonis and the Orbans, certainly. And I don't see much space for alliances around that area. And I think kind of coming back to the Swedish position, it's very different again, because the Swedish hawkish stance on Russia was always kind of very clear, and that's actually a core part of the nationalist agenda, if you like, as well in the Swedish context. But what I think kind of this reality might lead to is that these leaders who've been elected are still going to have to deliver to their base supporters somehow. And they're going to have to sort of show through some of their promises that there is clear blue water between them and the governments that have gone before, because, as I think we've both been implying, a lot of their support comes from a rejection of the status quo of the performance of the governments who've come before them. And so what I am expecting that we will see a kind of anti-coalition around is a sort of anti-internationalism project within the EU context. I think they will go in hard on questions like European cooperation on migration. This is relatively low-hanging fruit because the centre ground in Europe has moved so far to the right. And so it's relatively kind of low cost to push it back against any idea of Europe making us be more welcoming. And so I think that this will be sort of one of the key ways in which we may see some kind of alliance from these countries. And that, I think, could easily include Poland as well. I think Poland will, the PiS-led government will be very clear that they'll want to push back against any assumption that just because they've been welcoming to Ukrainian refugees, they've changed their mind on burden sharing within the EU more broadly on migration. And I think the other area where we could see pushback from this kind of anti-internationalist alliance in Europe is around the climate agenda, where I expect that the idea of a sustainable energy security, which has to include keeping on course with decarbonisation in Europe, will be rejected as being sort of pie in the sky internationalism. We need to focus on our short-term needs. We need to secure that. We can do this better at national level. So these are sort of areas where I do see potential for them to work together.
Great, thank you, very helpful. Sheri, what can and should, if anything, liberal democracies in Europe do to counter the popular appeal of these far-right parties? Is there sort of a common antidote that they can use? Or should they just let it be? Maybe they should just let it be. So
that's a big question. If I had an answer for that, boy, would I be really happy. So having said that I was going to throw up my hands, let me say something that I think is important, but maybe sort of obvious. I think these parties really do, and I think Susie kind of pointed in this direction as well, they really feed off dissatisfaction, whether it's dissatisfaction with the performance of governments in general, or it's dissatisfaction, about not being offered alternatives on immigration policy for, a very long period of time. I mean, the best way to deal with parties that are sort of at the extremes of the political spectrum, and again, by extremes, I mean just at the ends. I'm taking a wait and see attitude about the far right versus right part. Parties also that are focused on particular issues, immigration, national identity issues, is if the mainstream parties, and by mainstream parties, I mean those that are, sort of, I guess, center right, center left, that kind of thing, if they offer convincing solutions to citizens' problems and demands, if they provide good governance, that is to say, they deal with the challenges more broadly that societies face, the appeal of extremist parties just goes away. I mean, it just does. That is the way these kinds of things work. And so, as many observers of populism of both the right and the left have sort of pointed out, right, these parties are an expression of dissatisfaction, an expression of the failure of mainstream parties. And as observers and as people who care about democracy with a small d, we can recognize that this dissatisfaction is real without agreeing to the solutions that these parties offer to them. So we can say, look, economic change, social change, cultural change, demographic change has been extremely rapid, and for many people, very disconcerting over the past decades. And parties have not done a great job in preparing citizens for these changes, in offering policies that can help them deal with these changes, in offering good visions of what a better future can be like. So again, to circle back, sort of the obvious, but I still think important way to deal with these parties is by trying to figure out how the parties that we do think have strong commitments to small d democracy, to liberal democracy, they just simply need to do a better job of dealing with citizens' concerns and societal challenges.
Great, thank you. Before I go into my last question, I just want to let everyone who's listening know that if you have a question at any point, you can put it in the Q&A box, and I will start to audience questions right after this. So Susie, zooming out again a bit more now, how do these political shifts impact NATO or the transatlantic relationship?
Sorry, just lost my mute button there. I think there is a sort of an interesting trend in terms of transatlantic relations, in which a lot of the governments that we've been talking about so far are among the European governments which have been most fearful traditionally of doing anything to destabilize the transatlantic security guarantee. And I think that sort of national sort of framing on the discussion is almost as important in the position that we can expect from these parties as their political stance, actually. If you take, for example, the Polish government, they have always been among the governments that have been sort of most vocal about Europeans being naive about how malevolent Russia is, and I think there's a sense among those governments across Europe now that their warnings have been vindicated, and that their kind of strategic threat perception has moved now more to the kind of the center of Europeans' understanding of the world. But we've also seen from events in 2022 the extent to which we as Europeans, we're still very much dependent on the US when it comes to security questions. But also we've seen how supportive any US administration is of the idea of us building up our own capacities on the security front. So I think the realities the necessity in a dangerous world of us kind of doubling down and building up the European pillar of NATO, kind of go against the anti-EU narrative of some of these nationalist parties. So I think that we probably will see sort of continuing increases on security cooperation between European states. You know, we've seen 2 new members of the EU apply to NATO this year. So there is kind of greater and greater overlap between the EU and NATO, and I think it's no longer understood as an either or choice by any European state. But you know, I think the other decisive factor will be US politics, and I think, you know, a lot of European capitals are now admitting to themselves that if after 2024 we have another White House led by a Trump or Trump-like figure, then you know, we need to be prepared for that. And so I think that the sort of the anti-internationalist, anti-European narrative that I was talking about earlier will sort of come up to face with the realities of geopolitics. So I would expect that we will sort of continue on the curve that we're going on of trying to build European sovereignty at the same time as keeping the transatlantic ties strongly into place.
Great, thank you. Excellent. Well, that sort of concludes the first part of our discussion. Now, at this point, I'm going to start taking some questions from the Q&A box. And again, if you're listening and you want to ask questions, please feel free just to put them in the Q&A box. So I'm going to start with you, Sheri, with this question. And the person wants to know, is there any way to improve EU institutions to be more resilient or to effectively deal with countries like Hungary and Poland?
I get some easy questions. So, I mean, of course, there's lots of ways where you could imagine the EU being more resilient and more responsive, right? The problem really is the political blockages. I mean, again, with a sort of obvious example, there should be ways to punish democratic backsliding in the European Union. There should be more direct ways to punish Viktor Orban for the things that he has done in Hungary while he is a member of the European Union. And the way European institutions are set up, it is really quite hard to do that because a lot of critical things require unanimity, and changes that would allow the European Union to have more gradated tools to deal with something like an Orban require changes, again, that you're not going to get agreement on by Orban or parties and politicians who may want to follow down that path. So, you know, this is an issue that's hard to resolve simply because the way the European Union is constructed, certain kinds of things are not possible. So for big issues, I think that is that kind of thing really needs to be considered. As far as sort of more general things, I mean, look, the European Union has done, I think, a decent job of dealing with collective crises over the past years. I would probably give it something like I don't know, I'm a professor, a C+ or a B minus on things like COVID, responding to some of the fallout from Ukraine. There's obviously a huge debate going on now about how how the EU should deal collectively with the energy crisis and with migration. I suspect that what we're going to see is some kind of solution that's probably decent, but not great. And I think, you know, for plotting through, the EU does a decent job. Where it's really not good is where you have kind of extreme problems like an Orban that require, and also problems that require quick solutions. It's just not designed to deal with those kinds of challenges. And I think will continue to disappoint people who are looking for those kind of quick, decisive responses. But perhaps Susie has a better answer to that than I do.
No, in solidarity with your ranking thing, I was just going to share on the chats. that we worked on a project at ECFR earlier this year where we were essentially sort of trying to rank European performance and individual member state performance on these different areas, from tech to climate to health and to migration and so on. I think, you know, we did it with numbers rather than letters, but we came out somewhere similar to you. But yeah, I mean, I very much agree on this, that I think the kind of the case for European cooperation on the areas that citizens are concerned about is very clear, almost across the piece, that it's about sort of economies of scale. It's about operating as a continent-sized power in a world of where it's kind of there's systemic rivalry between two other continent-sized powers, and this is stuff that we have to do. But I think that the stuff that Europeans are really sort of struggling to grapple with at the moment is how you balance that defense of European interests with defending a kind of an international system which protects the things we've always said are European values: democracy, human rights, the rule of law. And I think here we're much less good at sort of tackling these issues internally so that we can project that in a credible way externally. And we're seeing in a lot of the different sort of debates around sort of collectively tackling global challenges at the moment, the effect that this is having on perceptions of Europe as a global actor around the world, but particularly in the global south. And it's very much kind of called into question. So I think this is a fundamental challenge for us in the next few years.
Great, thank you. I have two questioners who are asking about the, and I'll start with you, Susie, with this one, on the way that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has exacerbated tensions within the EU. So one questioner writes, to what extent do you believe that the war in Ukraine, funded and armed by the West, is contributing to the shift to right-wing governments in Europe? Do people in Italy, Sweden, UK, Bulgaria, and other countries believe that their governments are more concerned about the well-being of Ukraine than of their own citizens? And the other questioner is more of a statement, but was suggesting that the invasion of Ukraine has exacerbated an already strained situation. So what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I would say, on the one hand, there is no question that that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has exacerbated an already strained situation. I think we focus a lot, and rightly, on the positive unity that was shown in the first, let's say, 6-7 months of Russia's war among European states. But now we're going into the difficult phase, and I think one of the sort of key issues here for how this plays out in the European project is the level of sacrifice that European citizens, no, that's not the right word, perceived sacrifice that European citizens are willing to make for solidarity with Ukraine. Because if you look at public opinion polls, the Europeans remain relatively steadfast in their solidarity for Ukraine, in their assessment that it's Russia that is to blame for the war, and that Europe should take a stance. And I'm studying at the moment the sort of public perception around the energy transition in Europe, and you can see that even in some of the countries such as Finland, Estonia, who've had to make kind of really big decisions about how they shift very quickly their energy dependence in order to put in place this, the first few rounds of sanction packages, that the sense that the sanctions are still the right thing to do, given the abhorrent actions that Russia's carrying out in Ukraine, is very strong. But I think that as winter comes on, energy costs get higher, potential recession kicks in, then we will be struggling against European perceptions that it is the sanctions that are to blame for all of those things, which is not sort of technically the case, or it's not the only trigger for those things, but I think that is the public perception. And then we'll also sort of be dealing with the fact that, coming back to the potential long war scenario, that in public minds, the sanctions aren't working. They're not bringing an end to the war. They're not taking away Russia's ability to wage war financially. And they're not sort of increasing European power vis-a-vis Russia to sort of to change Putin's calculations. Now, if you go and ask most European policymakers, they will tell you, well, yeah, but that's not the point. Sanctions were never intended to work in a matter of weeks. This is a long-term game, and anyway, the sanctions have a moral value. But I think that that's quite a hard sell to a European public that is worried about all the things that we've been talking about, from security to the economy to migration and so on. So I think, yeah, from this point of view, that clearly the Ukraine war has had an impact and will continue to be a very difficult issue in the European public over the coming months.
Thank you. Sheri, we have a question. Someone wants to know about the dangers of far left politics and whether or not you can give any examples in Europe.
So it's a great question. I mean, I guess in a way, because if you had asked, 15 years ago around the financial crisis, it would have been a reasonable answer to give that the financial crisis would have boosted the appeal of parties that are, much more critical of capitalism, of neoliberalism, and of markets. And in fact, really a lot of that dissatisfaction, as we've already discussed, ended up getting channeled into far right rather than far left parties. So there aren't really strong far left parties. There is a decently, I want to be consistent. I wouldn't say far left in the sense of non-democratic, but certainly a movement to the left of traditional socialist or social democratic parties in a place like France. I don't think that, and it's not really even a party at this point, it's kind of a movement or a coalition. I don't think that's an anti-democratic movement or party, but it does offer some pretty significant, substantial critiques of the existing economic order. There was a small far left, formerly communist party in Germany, and similarly, sort of smaller far left parties in Spain and things like that. So they're not electorally really as strong as their counterparts on the right. And that is somewhat puzzling and in that sense interesting, because you would have expected to see the financial crisis boost that perspective insofar as the financial crisis caused a lot of harm, caused a lot of citizens pain and insecurity, and yet that's really not been the case. And that says something, I think, about the kinds of appeals that resonate with voters today.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Susie, you're muted. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to kind of just a small addition on this, that I would say that in terms of some of the anti-internationalist trends that we've been talking about and associating with the far right in this conversation so far. Here in France, NUPES, Jean-Luc Mélenchon's La France Insoumise is quite interesting because they're a pretty far left party, but that some of these characteristics I would also associate with certainly his rhetoric in the run-up to the presidential elections and so on, and the early phase of the war, Russia's war in Ukraine and so on. And so I think it is an important point that that we shouldn't forget that that there is this kind of this dynamic on the left of politics as well. That I think does also sort of play a potential threat in the context of the European project over the longer term. So yeah.
Thank you. Susie, staying with you, we have another question about the impact of major events on European cohesion. And this questioner wants to know about how Brexit has been having an impact on Europe in general. Union project.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in terms of the European project generally, I think that Brexit has been a kind of a unifying force, if you like, because the sort of the total political breakdown that we're seeing in the UK at the moment is not something which kind of looks desirable to any EU member state. And so I think that, you know, you can sort of argue about the extent to which the economic crisis that the UK is kind of currently facing is only a result of Brexit. But I think that that reality is a real cautionary tale to nationalist parties across the EU. And you know, you've seen since 2016 the anti-EU rhetoric from nationalist parties evolve to being not we leave the EU, but now we change the EU and we ensure that we can defend our interests. And this, you know, even Viktor Orban talks about a union of national member states and so on. And so I think from that point of view, Brexit sort of ironically hasn't really been a bad thing for European unity. But I think that in terms of Russia's war in Ukraine, we've seen the UK play an important role in terms of military support and diplomatic support for Ukraine. We've also seen the UK play sort of quite constructive diplomacy, building up unilateral coalitions that work. And so I would sort of say that over 2022, we sort of started to see an image of what the kind of the global Britain aspiration that came out of the UK government after Brexit might sort of look like, and how that might work in a constructive way. And then in the last few weeks, we've seen a decision by Liz Truss, who was sort of still Prime Minister then at the beginning of this month, to attend the first meeting of the European Political Community in Prague. This is a new kind of idea for cooperation beyond the EU that has been pushed very heavily by Paris, but we saw attendance from sort of almost all European states, including the UK. And I think that kind of wait and see approach, a desire to sort of maybe try to shape this forum from the beginning, is something which I wouldn't have expected from the UK a year ago, because it implies cooperation with the EU as an entity. And it, you know, there is a sense in which the European political community is intended to build up cooperation, particularly with candidate countries to the EU, while the accession process and the necessary reforms are working through, but to kind of keep that process on course. So, you know, I think sort of, yeah, again, the UK of a few months, years ago would have been quite wary of any sort of cooperation with the EU as an entity. So I think, you know, there are sort of positive developments, and we could, in the broader context of cooperation around security, in the NATO frameworks, cooperation around energy and so on, begin to see much more constructive relations between the EU and the UK than have been the case over the last few years.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. Sheri, we have someone who wants to know if you could compare the far-right movements in the US and in Europe.
Sure.
So just a short question.
Well, so the short answer to this is they've gone in opposite directions. And I think that says something about democracy in these two places. So if we look at, okay, we'll just use the term far-right parties in Western Europe, Sweden Democrats, we've mentioned, Brothers of Italy, National Front, National Rally, I don't know, some of the others of their, you know, the Danish versions of these. What's interesting is, again, at least on the surface, all of these parties have moderated over the past years. Many of these parties, including, of course, the National Front, National Rally in France, had much more radical origins. I mean, Marine Le Pen's father was much more radical, much more openly racist, anti-Semitic than she was. So again, even though we may question how true these developments are, there's no doubt that these parties are more moderate than they were when they were founded. Actually, sadly, what's happened in the United States is really just the opposite. We've seen a trajectory over, again, exactly the same period of time. Really, the start of populism in Europe is the 1980s. A shift gradually in the Republican Party to become more obstructionist, to shift further to the right on a whole variety of policy issues. And then, especially since 2016, really tipped from, greater obstructionism, more pronounced conservatism into what is clearly now anti-democratic, very clearly anti-democratic territory. And I think this says something very important about the state of democracy in Western Europe and in the United States. By all measures, organizations who do these kinds of things, Freedom House, VDEM, there really is not a significant threat to democracy in Western Europe. Again, I agree with Susie, wait and see. But those parties that we worry about have at least felt the need to present a more moderate face. The Republican Party has done just the opposite. And I think this both reflects and has obviously furthered very serious problems in American democracy. And so, again, I'm an American, so obviously one is always more sensitive to one's personal context, even when you strive to be an objective academic. I'm much more worried about democracy in the US than I am in Western Europe.
Thank you. In terms of worrying or paying attention, Susie, what are some of the countries that you might want to pay attention to their upcoming elections or politics in the future, because it might have an impact in Europe? Are there places that you're keeping an eye on that are of particular concern?
I live in France, and I am quite concerned about how the next presidential election is going to go here. And I think that if that goes in the direction of Marine Le Pen or her successor, then that will have huge implications for the rest of Europe, given the role that France plays. My strong feeling after the president, this is still 5 years off. We had the presidential elections here in France this year, but my strong feeling coming out of that process was that the worst possible thing in terms of France not swinging to Rassemblement National the next time around would be the next few years of sort of basically impasse, not sort of getting things done. And because, for all of the reasons that Sheri's actually been describing, that the best way to ward off sort of sympathy with extremist parties is to actually deliver. And I think that there's a strong sense in France at the moment that the government isn't delivering, so I'm very worried about that picture. From a different point of view, I am actually sort of quite concerned about sense outside Germany of disappointment with the current German coalition government. I think last December, when what's known as the traffic light coalition came in, with a coalition between Social Democrats, Liberal Party and the Greens, there was a lot of hopes that that Germany was kind of going to, in the coalition agreement, said that there was going to be a kind of a European German foreign policy, Green-led, and there was a sense that there was going to be kind of moral leadership for Europeans on keeping us on course through the green transition from Germany. And I think, there's a feeling that because of the constraints of keeping that coalition together, that's not coming from Germany now, and the focus is very much on sort of finding ways through in domestic politics. And so I think that too is important for the European project, because even though Germany's not going to kind of swing wildly politically, neither is it going to play that role in sort of holding the European project together. So yeah, I think I would highlight those two cases as countries that I'm feeling sort of nervous about in different ways.
All right, well, that is a good place and time to end. Thank you very much. This was a really fascinating discussion. I think I learned quite a bit from it, and I hope everyone else did too. Thank you both for taking your time. And just a few housekeeping notes before we end is on China. So we're looking at what Xi's third term means for China and the US. We'll be digging into some of the political, economic, and military levers that Xi has to offer. And that will be on Tuesday, also at 11 a.m. So please do join. And again, we are a small nonprofit. We're a membership organization. Please, spread the word about what we're doing. Friends and colleagues can join. We also take donations, so please do support our work. We really appreciate it. So thank you, Sheri. Thank you, Susie. This was a fascinating discussion, and thank you everyone for the really fantastic questions.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.